Hi everyone, thank you for watching another episode of Gaffer in Gear. In today's episode, I am finally reviewing the Aputure Nova P600cs. So if you're not familiar with these lights, they are a soft light panel that boasts 600 watt output. They are full RGB WW and have 4 lighting zones each. They also have CRMX control and Sidus link control. Now the lights have all of the color modes that you'd expect from a top line panel light. Now if you're looking to buy these as a Skypanel replacement, we're also going to do some comparisons with a Skypanel because there are areas in which a Skypanel is still dominant. So before we get deep into the review, I just thought I'd show off what these lights could do with this setup here. So I've got one of the Novas here running the fire effect, and as you can see, it uses all 4 light zones to generate a fire flicker. And the fire effect really is on a par with the fire effect that you get out of an RE Skypanel. So this and the Skypanel are the only 2 panel lights that I'd consider using to generate a fire effect. And if you're thinking it looks a little bit radical here, that's because I've adjusted the parameters so you can see what it's doing on screen. Now, the back wall behind me, that's lit with another Nova here, and that's running at 100% brightness doing primary blue, so a really dark color. Now, my key light is a LED ZEP 2 foot by 4 foot 350 watt panel with a half grid cloth, and my fill light is a Skypanel 60C with a snap bag with a half grid cloth running at 50%, and neither one of those has snap grids on it, so they're just flooding out. So I've got quite a bit of light hitting me here, and it's hardly affecting the saturation there on the background. So that gives you some idea of just how much firepower you can get out of these lights in their full color mode. Okay, so let's go through how much this thing costs and what you get for your money. So there is quite a bit of price variation in Australia. So the cheapest price I've found listed today was $4,900, and the most expensive price was $5,500 for the exact same identical kit. It seems to sell for a consistent $3,600 US. All right, so let's talk about the head first. So the build quality is sensational. You'd be hard pressed to find lights that are better built than this. The only light I can think of that's better built is the Vortex. Now, things that look like they're plastic when you're looking at it in, say, catalog photos, like the handle, that is metal. The only sort of real plastic is on the sides, but it looks like it's an industrial plastic. And again, I've been renting these things out for about 6 to 9 months, and they survive rentals no problem at all. All right, let's take a look at the front. So on the front, it has its flood perspex. Now that can be removed. So you've got 4 screws at the top, which you can lift up the flap on them and then twist them to undo. It's quite a painstaking process. Now, as far as I know, Aputure don't have an intensifier or anything like that you can drop in. So I don't know why you'd want to remove the diffuser anyway, but it is handy that it can be removed. So if you do manage to damage the diffuser, you can simply replace it. Now on the sides here, you've got your accessory slot. It only has the 1 accessory slot, but the good thing with the accessory slot is it does have a locking mechanism on the side here. So that locking mechanism securely locks any accessory in place automatically. You don't have to remember to lock anything at the top like with other lights. Okay, let's have a look at the back of the unit now. And I've only got one criticism with the design, and that is the feet. So the feet are on the edges. So if you're putting this on a shelf and the shelf isn't quite the width of the Nova, then it will fall over because there's no center foot here. But if you're in that situation, you can turn the light upside down and use the handle here as a center foot. But one thing to note is that the screws will scratch the surface that you're storing the light on. So you can store it upside down, no problem. Now, one thing that's nice with this light is the fans are centralized. Now, in terms of the fans, I've never had any issue with fan noise out of these, but having the fans in the center of the cooling system enables the light to be used in any orientation. 360 degrees by 360 degrees, the light will run no problem at all. One little detail I like on this light is it does have a fly screen mesh over all of the air vents, so the light won't fill up with insects. The stirrup is massively improved since the Nova P300. This is way stronger. Arnold Schwarzenegger could not get this to flex. Now, in terms of the only sort of negative with the stirrup, it does have a little bit of play in the lock. Now, by a little bit, for me, it's more than acceptable, but I've got to mention it because I am doing a thorough review. That's the amount of movement that's in there after you lock it. So it's not really going to become an issue. Now, in terms of lockers, it has dual disc brakes on each side. Now, from experience, what I've found is if you just lock it at the one side and you have something big like a DOP Choice 5-foot Octo with a snap grid, the one locker is going to hold it really securely, no problem at all, but it is reassuring to have that second lock off. Now, the stirrup can be removed by removing these 4 screws here. Now, that is a Torx connector, not an Allen key, so just make sure you've got a Torx connector if you're looking to do that. Now, in terms of the build quality of the stirrup, it can easily support the weight of the light if you've got the stirrup out at 90 degrees. And that is something important to note because you can't get a ball mount for these. So if you want to rotate the light horizontal to vertical, you're going to need an adapter like this, which will put the light out at 90 degrees. Now, I've already done a review on this clamp, so if you want to have a look at that, this is the episode to go to. Now, the next thing you get in the kit are your cables. So you get a Nutrix cable that supplies the power to the light, and this is 5 meters. This is a really handy length. How do I know that? Because everybody keeps stealing these on rentals. You also get a 3 meter 5-pin to 5-pin XLR cable that can connect the controller to the light. Now, just something to note, you can't use this as a DMX cable. It's got different tolerances. Now let's talk about the controller, and this controller is genius. So you can use the controller on the light, and you can also remove the controller. Now, if you're using it on the light, you don't need a cable because it connects via these pins. Now, at this point, we've got exposed pins here, but they can't be shorted out, so you don't need to worry about that. Now, if your firmware is up to date, you should be able to disconnect the controller from the light and then connect it via its cable, and everything should stay running. You should also be able to connect the controller back onto the light, disconnect the cable, and everything should maintain its settings and stay running. If you can't do that, you need to update your firmware. Now, here's where this controller is genius. The CRMX receiver for this light is not built into the light, it's built into the controller. So if you have the light positioned somewhere where it can't receive CRMX, maybe it's around the corner of a building and out of line of sight to your transmitter, you can separate the receiver and put it line of sight to the transmitter and still get CRMX commands to the light. Now, you can connect up to 2 of these leads, giving you 6 meters of separation. Now, here's something that you can do with the controllers. You could set a color, for example, and then take the controller off the light, transfer that to another light, and the settings will go across. Now, here's the fun bit. You can save up to 4 settings per controller. Those settings are saved in the controller, not the light. So I could have 4 presets and move those from light to light with the controller. And using another controller, I'd have a combination of 8 presets that are hardware saved and movable from light to light. Now, just something to note here. If you don't have the controller attached to the light and you power it down, you cannot power it back on until you attach the controller, because the power switch is on the controller itself. Now let's have a look at our inputs and outputs. So on the side of the controller, you have a USB port. That USB port is for firmware updates. You can also update via the phone app. On the bottom of the controller, we have our DMX in and out, which is 5-pin XLR. On the top of the controller, we have a 5-pin XLR that connects the controller to the light. Now here's the catch. We've got a 5-pin XLR there and a 5-pin XLR there. So it is possible for people to get confused and plug into the wrong outlet. If you do that, nothing gets damaged, but nothing works. Now on the bottom of the light, we've got our 3 inlets. We've got our controller inlet, we've got our 48 volt DC inlet, and our Nutrix power connector in. Now the light isn't sold with a bag, but you can get this optional transport case. Now it has handles on the top, the side and the bottom. It has compartments for the controller and the cables, as well as space for the optional lightning clamp, which you can use to attach the controller to the light stand, and room for one light modifier. And the light is fully secured underneath. Okay, now let's get into the cons and pros, starting off with the cons first. Possibly the biggest negative with these is they are not high-speed flicker-free. Now, according to my frequency meter, these are flicker-free at up to 4000 FPS, but because I own 3 of these and I've had them for quite some time and I've been out in the real world, I can tell you from experience that if you're shooting at, say, 120 frames per second, no problem at all. But if you're on a shoot with a phantom camera at 1000 frames per second, these flicker like crazy. So we're not talking about a little bit of flicker in the shadows that's barely noticeable. It is absolutely in your face, the flicker. So I don't know what's happened with the Aputure lights in the last year or so, but they just don't seem to be high-speed flicker-free anymore. Okay, the next negative for me is to do with the color render when you're in your low CCTs. So the first thing I better point out is these things have a CCT range from 2000 Kelvin all the way up to 10,000 Kelvin, adjustable in 50 Kelvin increments. Now from about 2400 Kelvin below, I think that CCT range is a bit of a gimmick because the color render is really terrible down there. Now, once you get to about 2500 Kelvin, the color render is awesome. So 2500 above, one of the best lights that you can get on the market in terms of color render. Now, one of the pros with this light is everything is built in. There's no separate power supply, but that's also one of my big negatives. What I have found is the amount of weight that this thing has with everything being built in can give you problems if you're trying to set it up on a Menace arm. For example, with the RE Skypanel, you can take the power supply off the back and move that power supply down to the counterweight end and help you out a little bit. Whereas with this unit, you're going to have to put an additional shot bag or additional weight at the other end of the Menace arm. So that takes you from, say, using a standard wind-up stand to something that's heavier to take the payload weight. The next negative for me is the gels mode, or more to the point, the fact that the Nova doesn't preview the gels in real time as you're scrolling through the menu system. So I'll explain what I mean. Pretty much the only time I ever use a gels mode now is if I've got a client who wants a color on a background wall, but they don't know what color they want. And if I scroll through a HSI mode, that just seems to confuse them. So what I do in that case is I just pull up a gels library in a Skypanel and just scroll through it. And I tell them, look, when you see a color you like, let me know, and I'll save that as a preset. However though, if you're using the Aputure Nova and you're in the gels mode, as you scroll through the gels menu, it doesn't change. It only changes when you hit enter and select the color you want. So unless you know exactly which gel you're looking for, or you happen to have a gel swatch book, this mode really isn't all that usable. Now, the last things that could be negatives for some of you, the light doesn't have an Ethernet port for communications, it doesn't have a power through, and it doesn't have an IP rating. All right, let's start going through the pros while I'm still friends with Aputure. Okay, so above 2500 Kelvin, the color render in these lights is superb. They're amongst the best that you can get. Now, in terms of rentals, these things are built really solid. They can take a beating. So these have been out on jobs on rentals for about 6 months now. They don't go out in a case because the case often doesn't fit in the rental client's car. So they've just been out exposed to the elements in the world. They're scuffed up a little bit, but nothing has broken on them. And you can do things like take the controller off and put that in a separate little bag to make sure the controller doesn't get damaged. There are no knobs on here that are going to get destroyed if the thing impacts with something else in transport once you take the controller off. Now, also in terms of rentals, these things have become hugely popular. They have overtaken Skypanels in terms of panel lights to rent. And a lot of my rental clients say it is down to how simple these things are to operate. They are extremely easy to use. One thing that's been a big surprise positive for me with these Novas is the color modes. Initially, I wasn't a fan of the color modes. I thought they were over the top. Let's say, for example, an RE Skypanel gives you realistic looking colors that you'd find out in the real world at full saturation. If you use an Aputure Nova P600 on a location in full saturation, it suddenly looks like a K-pop video, and I wasn't really a fan of that. I thought it was just far too over the top, but here's where I've changed my mind about that. So we've got a wall here that's got a lot of white light hitting it. Now with pretty much all my other panel lights, if I wanted to color that wall, I would have to protect it from white light first. I would have to put up floppies, make sure I've got snap grids on my key lights, so I don't have all of this white light desaturating the color that I'm going to put on the wall to start with. But that is not the case with these Novas. Because they have that rich color saturation to start with, they have less of a problem with getting desaturated by stray light hitting your wall. So it's not just a rich, vibrant color like that pink or purple there. It's the same all the way through the color range. It just seems to not be bothered as much by stray light. And that saves me a lot of time in setting up. I'm using a lot less floppies and things like that. Now the Aputure Novas definitely can't generate the same color gamut as RGB ALC lights, but they definitely feel like they can generate more colors than my other RGB lights can. Now in this test here, I've got the Nova versus the Skypanel, so that people who own Skypanels can have a comparison to see if the Nova is a good replacement. Now just something to note, because my camera only records in Rec 709, the Skypanel and the Nova appear to be the same color saturation. I'm doing the color adjustments in increments of 10 color vectors. If I hit a primary or secondary color, I'll take note of it here. Now, this might seem like a foregone conclusion, but the Skypanel and the Nova have different strengths when it comes to generating colors. The Skypanel might surprise you in a few areas. Let's begin the test. The Nova definitely has better reds and oranges. Between yellow and primary green, the Nova is very green dominant, like most RGB lights. Between green and cyan, the Nova has way more increments of adjustment. And it's the same between cyan and blue. The Skypanel seems to race to magenta from blue, whereas the Nova again seems to have more increments of adjustment. And between magenta and red, the Nova seems to have less adjustment in the last 20 color vectors. Now the next big plus for these lights is the amount of firepower you get in the form factor. So we're looking at something that's roughly a 2 foot by 1 foot and a flood. Now later on in the video, I give you stats like f-stops and lux numbers, but I'm going to give you some other lights to compare it to so you understand where it fits in. Now the thing to note here is with these other lights, we're comparing them in their maximum flood mode, which is what this does. So for example, we're not having a look at the brightness levels of this versus a vortex with the vortex in its native 20-degree spot. We're only comparing the floods. And the other things to note is this thing is 600 watt output. A lot of the lights we're comparing it to are only 400 watt output. So it is a little bit unfair. All I'm really doing is comparing the form factor as a flood light. At 3200 Kelvin, the Aputure Nova P600c is 23% brighter than the Caster, 51% brighter than the RE Skypanel S60C. It's 77% brighter than the Gemini 2x1 Hard with its dome reflector on, and 147% brighter than the Vortex 8 with its dome reflector on. At 5600 Kelvin, the Nova comes in at 46% brighter than the Skypanel S60C, 48% brighter than the Caster, 82% brighter than the Gemini 2x1 Hard with its dome reflector, and 116% brighter than the Vortex 8 with its dome reflector. Now here are my brightness readings at 1 meter and at 3 meters. Now in this test, I'm about 2.5 meters away from the wall. And as you can see, we've got plenty of spread. So you could easily use this to light something big like an octadome, even light up a 12x12 frame or a cyc wall. And this light has a 1:1 ratio with its color light emitters and its white emitters, which gives you a huge amount of firepower in the color modes. Now that additional firepower could come in handy if you need to go through something like a honeycomb or an egg crate. So this is their honeycomb, which is an additional extra that you can purchase. Let's take a look at it while we're here. So it gives you plenty of control, as you can see, and it has a nice slim profile. Now, just to see what it's doing, let's take it out so we've got a comparison. All right, that brings us to our next positive. There are loads of affordable quality accessories that are available for this, many of which I've already reviewed, such as the rain jacket, the soft box, and the double yoke. They also have a space light, which is pretty cool, but I haven't reviewed that yet. Another accessory that's available is these barn doors, which have Velcro attachable spill guards to stop any light from spilling out between the barn doors and the light. Let's take a look. All right, let's talk about the DMX, and a lot of people are going to be worried about the DMX capabilities of the Nova P600c for the simple reason that its forerunner, the Nova P300c, had abysmal DMX when it was released. So Aputure have learnt from their mistakes. This has more processing power, it has smooth 16-bit dimming, and built-in CRMX. Now, I don't usually run promo material in my episodes, but because the Nova P300 was really terrible with its DMX, I think it's important to show off what the DMX capabilities of this unit are, and I simply can't do that with an Exalux, so here's their promo. Now let's go through the pros and cons of the DMX, and unlike the Nova P300s when they were first released, this has loads of useful profiles. And the other advantage with this is it has very good smoothing, so even if you're using an antique board like this, you can get very, very smooth results. Even right down low on the dimmer, it beautifully smooths things out. But that smoothing does come at a cost. This light seems to be somewhere around a 1/4 to half a second behind the faster lights when it comes to DMX queuing. So you're going to see that when I do the test with this versus the Skypanel. Now the next negative for me with the DMX, this light really could do with the option of full channels or reduced channels with the DMX profiling. So for my liking, this thing's burning far too many DMX channels, but some people I've spoken to who have these really love the way that some of the profiles are set up. So we're just going to go through here the CCT HSI crossover mode so you can see what I'm talking about, and this is the basic 8-bit mode. So the CCT HSI crossover mode uses 8 channels. Channel 8 is the strobe, so I'm not going to play around with that too much in case some of you are photoepileptic. All right, so channel 1 is our intensity, as you'd expect. Channel 2 is our CCT. Channel 3 is our plus minus green. Now, so nothing unusual there. Channel 4 is our crossover. So that crosses over from the CCT mode on these 2 channels to the next 3 channels, which is your HSI. So let's swing up a crossover here. And as you can see, as I do that, the CCT changes, the Kelvin changes. That's because we have a separate channel here for the CCT when you're operating in the HSI mode. Okay, so this channel here is selecting your base saturation Kelvin in the HSI mode. We've got our saturation and we've got our color hue. Okay, so why some people I've spoken to like this, they can't afford a fancy DMX desk, they're running a basic desk like this. In this profile, you can have a CCT. Let's say you're using these lights to light a cyc wall. and all you can afford is this, that's all you've got. We've all done those really low budget jobs. You can set a CCT as scene 1, and you can have you can select using this here a second scene with a color and a different base CCT and cross over between the two. Okay, so that's why a lot of people love these the profiles that are in this. Now you could also, if you wanted to be daring, you could have one mode here, one save or one scene, and then crossfade to a different CCT. Let's make that a bit more obvious. So that's CCT number 1. Let's crossfade to another CCT, and then you could also crossfade to a full saturated color. So in a basic profile like this one has, you could do a bit of queuing if you've got a boring old basic desk like this. But what if you're using a DMX controller that can save scenes and crossfade in between those scenes for you, like the Exolux here, or pretty much 99.99995% of DMX desks? Well, if that's the case, this mode is wasting a CCT channel that you don't need, and it's wasting a saturation or a crossfade channel that you don't need. So that's 2 channels per light. So on a big studio job, if you were running, say, 80 of these on separate channels, that's 160 DMX channels that have been wasted. In addition to that, having 2 CCT channels and having 2 crossfader channels could also result in unnecessary confusion when programming the desk. All right, let's get into the DMX testing. I have the Nova P600c running off an 8-bit CCT HSI crossover profile, and it's receiving its DMX commands via its internal CRMX receiver. To give you something to compare it to, I have the Skypanel S60C, which is also in an 8-bit CCT HSI crossover profile, and it is receiving its commands via an external CRMX receiver. Both lights will be receiving their commands at the same time. Let's start off with instant on-off commands. Now let's take a look at some half-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 1-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 2.5-second cues. And now some 5-second cues. Now let's have a look at some CCT changeovers between 3200 and 5600 Kelvin, starting with instant changeovers. Now some half-second changeovers. Now some 1-second changeovers. Now some 2.5-second changeovers. Now some 5-second changeovers. Now let's have a look at some changeovers between white light and the HSI mode, starting with instant changeovers. Now some half-second cues. Now some 1-second cues. Now some 2.5-second cues. And now some 5-second cues. Now this is one of the effects in the light called color gradient, and this is running at 5% brightness. Okay, let's take a look at the data I've collected, starting off with AC power draw. The maximum power draw recorded over several days of testing was 712 watt. At 3200 Kelvin I measured 643 watt, and at 5600 Kelvin I measured 650 watt. According to my frequency meter, the dimmer system is running pulse width modulation at 20 kHz. In the menu system, you can add an additional 2 kHz in 100 Hz steps. Now, according to my frequency meter, this should be high-speed flicker free, but as you can see here, it isn't. Let's have a look at the dimming results at 3200 Kelvin. I've taken readings at 100%, 50%, 10% and 5% brightness. As you can see, there is almost no shift in the CCT. The color render stays the same and the white point barely moves. At 5600 Kelvin, it's a similar result. The maximum CCT shift is only 25 Kelvin. Right down the bottom at 5% brightness, there is a slight drop in color render of 1%. And once again, the white point is very stable. Now let's take a look at the color render recorded in TM30RF. At 2000 Kelvin, it has a very low color render score, and that slowly creeps up to a respectable 95 by 2500 Kelvin. Between 2550 to 2900 Kelvin, it comes in with a very good score of 96. Between 2950 to 5100 Kelvin, that drops to a very respectable 95. And from 5150 to 6000 Kelvin, it comes in with an excellent 96. Now let's take a look at our average CCT accuracies. And the higher the target value you dial in, the more this light is out by. Between 2000 to 3000 Kelvin, it is typically out by plus or minus only 16 Kelvin. Between 3050 to 4000 Kelvin, it is out by typically minus 55 Kelvin. Between 4050 to 5000 Kelvin, that jumps to minus 100 Kelvin. And between 5050 to 6000 Kelvin, that jumps to an average of 141 Kelvin, which is still respectable. Now let's have a look at our white point measured in delta UV. And this light tracks strictly to the Planckian curve. So what I mean by that, it doesn't deviate to the daylight curve in the daylight CCTs. The most the light is out by is down at 2000 Kelvin with a delta UV of minus 0.0020, and by 2150 Kelvin that has creeped up very close to the Planckian curve. Between 2200 to 3000 Kelvin, it is out by an average of plus or minus only 0.0002. Between 3050 to 4000 Kelvin, it is out by plus or minus 0.0004. Between 4050 to 5000 Kelvin, it is out by minus 0.0007. And between 5050 to 6000 Kelvin, it is out by plus or minus 0.0003. Let's take a closer look at some of our kelvins, starting off with the lowest kelvin that we can dial in. When I dialed in 2000 Kelvin, I got 1916, with a very average TN30 colour render score of 55% average colour accuracy with a 98% average colour saturation. But take a close look at the circle here. This is where the averages can lie. 98% average saturation sounds a lot better than what actually appears here. Here are the CRI scores, or at least what shows up. And the spectrum distribution is very anorexic, which explains the colour render scores. And the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0020, which would make the light magenta to less than a 1/8 correction gel at this point. Now, because so many of our lights only go down to 2700 Kelvin, I've decided to take a look at that as well. When I dialed in 2700 Kelvin, I got 2677, with a very good TN30 colour render score of 96% average colour accuracy with a 102% average colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores, and only R11 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point is almost perfect with a delta UV of minus 0.0001. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3161 with an SSI score of 85. The TN30 colour render results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 104% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores. R4, R9 and R11 are all below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point is almost perfect with a delta UV of minus 0.0002. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4306. The TN30 colour render results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 104% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores. R9, R11 and R12 are below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0008. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5475 with an SSI score of 75. The TN30 colour render results were 96% average colour accuracy with an average 104% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores. R11 and R12 are below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point is almost smack on the Planckian curve with a delta UV of plus 0.0001. But if you're working to the daylight curve, that would make this light slightly magenta by a little bit more than a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in the top Kelvin of 10,000, I got 9390. The TN30 colour render scores still came in with a respectable 92 with a 101% average colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R9 and R12 are below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the light is still tracking very close to the Planckian curve with a delta UV of minus 0.0008. Let's have a look now at how accurately these lights can dial in their colour vectors. Red, which should be 0, came in at 1 degree. Green, which should be 120, came in at 117 degrees. Blue was smack on at 240 degrees. Yellow, which should be 60 degrees, came in very close at 63. However, I'd recommend dialing in 40 if you want a good looking yellow. Cyan, which should be 180 degrees, came in at 185. And magenta, which should be 300 degrees, came in at 291. Now these lights have an advanced HSI mode that enables you to desaturate the light to any Kelvin that the light can dial in, which is why I haven't given you any desaturation values. That's another episode of Gaffer and Gear done. See you on the next episode. Take care.